Close your eyes. Picture the year 1863. The United States is tearing itself apart. More than 1 million men are locked in a brutal civil war. The president sits in the White House, exhausted, his 10-year-old son recently dead, the weight of the Union, and the fate of 4 million enslaved people, resting on his shoulders. Now, picture where that man started. Not the marble and granite monument, but the truth, a one-room dirt-floor log cabin in the Kentucky wilderness. No windows. No running water. No books. A boy with less than 12 months of formal schooling, who taught himself to read by firelight. A man who failed at business, who was constantly mocked for his awkward height and his plain, homespun clothes. This is not the story of a destined leader. This is the story of a man who should have been forgotten, a man perpetually burdened by debt, failure, and melancholy. Yet, the failures did not define him. His fierce, self-forged inner life did. He was Abraham Lincoln. This is a journey not just through history, but through the essence of human perseverance. We will trace the line of courage and conviction that ran straight through his life, from the frontier preacher's son, to the circuit-riding lawyer, to the president who wrote the single most revolutionary sentence in American history, that all men are created equal. We will witness his evolution from an ambitious young politician to the leader who would redefine freedom and democracy for the entire world. His life is the proof that the highest character can emerge from the humblest origins. Welcome to Abraham Lincoln, a life of courage and conviction. Now, let's begin at the beginning, in the cold Kentucky wilderness of 1809. Chapter 1, Humble Beginnings. Kentucky and Indiana, the Frontier Years, 1809 to 1830. On a bitter, frigid February morning in 1809, in a crude, 16 by 18-foot log cabin near Hodgenville, Kentucky, a child was born. His parents, Thomas and Nancy Hanks Lincoln, were dirt poor and barely literate. They had no idea they had brought forth a son who would one day change the soul of a nation. They named him Abraham, a tribute to his grandfather who had been killed years earlier by Native Americans. The cabin where Abraham Lincoln first drew breath was a primitive box of split logs, with mud and clay stuffed into the gaps to keep the wind out. There was no glass for windows, only a flickering fire in the stone hearth that provided the only light, heat, and defense against the vast, dark wilderness surrounding them. This was home. Thomas Lincoln was a hard-working carpenter and farmer, a strong man who valued manual labor. He was constantly struggling to acquire and hold land, and his family was perpetually just one bad harvest away from starvation. Nancy Hanks Lincoln was different. She had a gentle spirit and a gift for storytelling. Though she could barely read, she fiercely encouraged what little book learning she could offer her son. Life on the Kentucky frontier was a relentless, bone-grinding fight. The Lincoln family lived surrounded by bears, wolves, and the constant threat of nature. Young Abraham's earliest memories were not of games or school, but of hard labor, carrying water from the spring, swinging a heavy axe to help clear land, and sharing meager meals of cornmeal mush and wild game. It was a childhood without softness, a daily lesson in grim endurance. Yet, even as a small boy, Abraham was distinct from his peers. While other children embraced the physical toil, Abraham was captivated by words. He listened intently to every neighbor's tale and hungrily absorbed his mother's Bible stories, later retelling them with a dramatic flair that seemed utterly misplaced on the hard-bitten frontier. There was a restless mind forming, desperate for more than dirt and toil. When Abraham was 7, the family moved across the Ohio River to Indiana. Thomas was losing another land claim, and perhaps more importantly, he harbored a profound moral objection to slavery. Indiana was free territory. But the fresh start was crueler than the land they left behind. They arrived in December, and Thomas hastily built a half-faced camp, 3 walls and a roof, with one side completely open to the winter wind. They huddled together around a ceaseless fire to survive that first brutal winter. By the next year, they had a proper cabin, and life became slightly more bearable. Abraham, thin and gangly, worked tirelessly, splitting rails and clearing the land. But his inner life was still elsewhere, usually in a book. The Shadow of Loss. Then, in 1818, the world dropped out from beneath the 9-year-old boy. A terrible disease called milk sickness swept through the area. Nancy Lincoln fell ill. For a week, Abraham and his older sister, Sarah, watched helplessly as their mother faded. Nancy called her children to her bedside and gave them her final charge, to be good and kind. On October 5, 1818, Nancy Hanks Lincoln died at age 34. Thomas built a rough coffin from fresh green lumber, and they buried her on a hillside near the cabin without a minister or a proper ceremony. The loss devastated Abraham. His mother had been the source of light and encouragement. Now she was gone. The immense emptiness in the cabin, and in the boy's heart, was total. This raw grief would later translate into the extraordinary empathy that marked his leadership. For a year, the household was cheerless and dirty. Thomas knew his children needed help. So, in the fall of 1819, he traveled back to Kentucky and convinced a capable widow, Sarah Bush Johnston, to marry him. Sarah arrived at the Indiana cabin with her own 3 children and a wagon full of household goods, furniture, and, critically, books. She took one look at the neglected, ragged 10-year-old boy and her heart went out to him. She cleaned him up, gave him proper clothes, and treated him with the respect and love he so desperately craved. Abraham would later say she was his best friend in the world. Sarah Bush Lincoln instantly recognized his unique hunger. While Thomas saw books as a waste of time, Sarah championed Abraham's education. He devoured every scrap of print she brought, including the family Bible, Aesop's Fables, and a biography of George Washington. He read by firelight, late into the night. The self-made mind. In total, Abraham Lincoln received less than 1 year of formal education in his entire life. But what he lacked in schooling, he gained through an insatiable discipline. He would walk miles to borrow a book, famously once working 3 days pulling fodder just to pay for a borrowed book that rain had damaged. He did not just read, he mastered the material. He believed he couldn't truly understand a concept until he could explain it to someone else. His stepmother recalled finding him alone in the woods, pacing and gesturing as he practiced speeches, reasoning through ideas, and honing a brilliant, singular mind. As he grew to a towering 6 feet 4 inches, unusually tall for the era, he became rail-thin but immensely strong from years of splitting rails and farm work. He was known to sink an axe blade deeper into wood than any man around. But this physical prowess created the great rift with his father. Thomas valued the work of the hands, Abraham valued the work of the mind. Lincoln later recalled that his father taught him to work, but never taught him to love it. He felt trapped by the limitations of the frontier, a cage of endless, backbreaking toil. The world awakens. That cage opened slightly in 1828. At age 19, he was hired to help take a flatboat loaded with goods down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. It was the first time he saw the wide world, and it was the first time he saw slavery in its rawest, most brutal form, human beings being bought and sold at auction like livestock. The sight repulsed him and confirmed the moral compass his father had nudged. The seeds of conviction were taking root. By 1830, Thomas Lincoln decided to move one last time, to Illinois. Abraham went with him, helping to build yet another cabin. But that winter, one of the worst on record, the winter of the deep snow, was the last hardship he would share with his father. At 22 years old, with almost no formal education, no money, and no prospects beyond his strength and his sharp mind, Abraham Lincoln made his definitive choice. He would leave the farm. He would leave his father's house. He would strike out on his own. He set out on foot with no idea where he was going. But the foundation was unbreakable. The boy who was forged in the fire of loss, who found salvation in books, and who mastered himself through sheer force of will, that boy was ready to begin his legendary ascent. Chapter 2, Self-Education and Early Ambitions. The Making of a Mind, 1830 to 1834. In the spring of 1831, Abraham Lincoln arrived in the village of New Salem, Illinois, with little more than the clothes on his back and an uncertain future. New Salem was a small, dusty frontier settlement, a scattering of cabins and a mill perched above the Sangamon River. Its big dreams of becoming a major port would never materialize, but for Abraham Lincoln, New Salem would become the most important classroom of his life. Lincoln's introduction to the village was immediately memorable. He had been hired to help pilot a flatboat loaded with goods down the river. When the boat became hopelessly stuck on the New Salem mill dam, the villagers gathered to watch the inevitable disaster. Lincoln took charge. He had the cargo shifted, bored a hole in the stern to drain the water, and with quick, cool logic, refloated the vessel. That single incident, solving an impossible problem with calm logic, provided the perfect template for the man Abraham Lincoln would become. He returned to New Salem in July 1831, deciding this was the place where he would finally make something of himself. He was 22, 6 feet 4 inches tall, thin as a rail, with unruly black hair and a face that was more honest than handsome. But when he spoke, people listened. Lincoln's first job was as a clerk in the general store. The store was New Salem's social center, and Lincoln thrived there, holding court on the counter with endless jokes, anecdotes, and funny tales. He became famous not just for his humor, but for his absolute integrity. Stories spread about Honest Abe, how he walked miles to return a few cents he had accidentally overcharged a customer, insisting on scrupulous fairness in all his dealings. Yet beneath the humor and the storytelling, Lincoln was engaged in something far more serious, the systematic, ferocious education of his own mind. Every spare moment, he read. He worked through Kirkham's English grammar to improve his writing, and he devoured newspapers to follow the political debates of the day. He discovered poetry, memorizing long, melancholic passages from Robert Burns and Lord Byron, reflecting the awareness of mortality that shadowed his life. But the book that affected him most profoundly was the complete works of William Shakespeare. Shakespeare's language, his profound understanding of human nature, and his ability to capture both tragedy and comedy resonated deeply with Lincoln. Shakespeare taught him that language could be beautiful as well as functional, and that the right words, arranged in the right order, could move hearts and change minds. Lincoln also tackled Euclid's geometry, an unusual choice for a frontier clerk. He was drawn to the logical precision of mathematical proofs. He loved that if you started with true premises and reasoned correctly, you arrived at true conclusions every time. He learned to build every argument not as rhetoric, but as an inescapable proof. Through all this study, Lincoln was systematically forming his character and his moral compass. He believed in honesty, justice, and the fundamental equality of all people. He also began to test his skills in public speaking at the local debating society. His first attempts were awkward, a few halting words, his face burning with embarrassment. But he persevered, and gradually discovered his gift for clear, logical argument. He found mentors who lent him books and encouraged his ambitions. But New Salem was still the frontier, and respect was also earned through physical courage. Lincoln's reputation was cemented by a famous confrontation with Jack Armstrong, the champion wrestler of the rough, Clary's Grove Boys. Though reluctant, Lincoln accepted the challenge. The details of the match are murky, but the result was clear: Lincoln earned Armstrong's complete respect. From that day forward, the Clary's Grove Boys became his loyal supporters. Lincoln proved he could operate in both worlds. He could quote Shakespeare and wrestle with the town tough. In 1832, Lincoln made his first venture into politics, briefly serving as a captain in the militia during the Black Hawk War, his first electoral victory. When he returned, he ran for the Illinois state legislature. He was 23, largely self-educated, and had little money. He campaigned hard, but fate dealt him a devastating blow. Denton Offutt's store failed, leaving Lincoln unemployed and facing a crushing, insurmountable debt. For a man who valued honesty above all, this was a moral crisis. He wryly called it the national debt, and it would follow him, haunting his finances for the next 17 years. When the votes were counted in August 1832, Lincoln lost. But in his own precinct of New Salem, where people knew him best, he received an overwhelming 277 votes out of 300 cast. He was unknown countywide, but locally, his character was already proven. The defeat taught him the need for wider organization, but it did not discourage him. He took any work he could find, including postmaster, which let him read all the incoming newspapers, and teaching himself surveying from a book. What Lincoln truly wanted, however, was to master law. He borrowed heavy legal texts like Blackstone's commentaries and began to read law on his own. He approached the law the same way he had approached geometry, as a system of logic that could be mastered through discipline and reason. People in New Salem grew accustomed to seeing the tall, lanky figure walking down the road, completely absorbed in a law book. By 1834, Lincoln was ready to try again. He ran a better organized campaign, with the crucial backing of his New Salem friends. In August 1834, the votes were counted, and this time, Abraham Lincoln won. At age 25, the self-taught rail-splitter was elected to the Illinois state legislature. He had to borrow money just to buy his first suit of clothes suitable for a legislator. The rough store clerk and surveyor was becoming a politician. But he would never forget the lessons of New Salem, the power of logic, the necessity of patience, and the fundamental dignity of the common man he was now sworn to represent. Chapter 3, Lawyer and Legislator. Building a Career, 1834 to 1842. In December 1834, Abraham Lincoln arrived in Vandalia, Illinois, to take his seat in the state legislature. He was 25, wearing a new, borrowed suit, and carrying everything he owned in his saddlebags. Though Vandalia was small, the legislature brought together the most ambitious men in Illinois. Lincoln was the youngest member and one of the poorest, but he was determined to prove his worth. The debates were rowdy and often lasted late into the night. Lincoln mostly listened during his first session, observing the system, learning who held power, and how it was exercised. He voted consistently with the Whig Party, supporting internal improvements like roads, canals, and railroads that would help develop the state. His colleagues noted his quiet, logical mind and clear arguments. Even as he was learning to be a legislator, he pursued his other great ambition, becoming a lawyer. During recesses and free time, he continued his intense self-study. He had no teacher to guide him through the complexities of legal reasoning. He took his determination, his discipline, and the law books lent to him by Springfield attorney John Todd Stewart, and put them to work. Lincoln approached law with characteristic thoroughness. He didn't just memorize rules and precedents, he worked to understand the principles underlying the law. He viewed the legal structure like his beloved geometry, a system where one could build arguments from evidence and precedent until the conclusion became inescapable. In September 1836, after more than 3 years of relentless siege upon his legal texts, Lincoln received his law license from the Illinois Supreme Court. At 27, he had accomplished a remarkable feat. He had transformed himself through sheer force of will from an unschooled frontiersman into a professional attorney. Moving to Springfield. Shortly after, Lincoln made a decision that would shape the rest of his career. He moved to Springfield. The legislature had voted to relocate the state capital there, a move Lincoln had championed. In April 1837, Lincoln rode into the new capital with little more than $7 in his pocket. He quickly found an anchor in the city through an unexpected friendship. When he arrived at Joshua Speed's general store to ask about buying bedding, he confessed he was too poor to pay for it unless he could find work. Touched by Lincoln's honesty, Speed offered to share his own room above the store. The two men became deep friends, a bond that would sustain Lincoln through many dark moments. Lincoln immediately formed a law partnership with John Todd Stewart. In those early years, the practice of law required constant travel. The state was divided into judicial circuits, and judges and lawyers would spend weeks traveling from county to county, riding the circuit. Twice a year, Lincoln would load his saddlebags with his essentials and join the judicial caravan. Circuit riding was hard, primitive work. Lawyers traveled over rough roads, often staying in rough taverns or private homes, frequently sharing beds with strangers. But it was here that Lincoln forged his skills. He handled every kind of case: property disputes, criminal prosecutions, and debt collection. He learned by doing, gradually developing his skills as a trial lawyer. Lincoln discovered a natural talent as a courtroom advocate. He could simplify the most complex legal issues, explaining them in language that ordinary jurors could understand. More importantly, people trusted him. His reputation for absolute honesty meant that when he made an argument, judges and jurors believed him. Stories of Honest Abe solidified during this period. Once, Lincoln stopped arguing in the middle of a trial after discovering his client's case was based on a lie, declaring to the court he could not pursue an unjust claim. Another time, after winning a substantial legal fee for a poor widow, he returned most of the money to her, stating she needed it far more than he did. These acts were not for public show, they were the essence of the man. In 1841, Lincoln formed a new partnership with Stephen Logan, one of Springfield's most respected attorneys. Logan was meticulous and served as an excellent teacher, pushing Lincoln to be more thorough and precise in his arguments. Under Logan's tutelage, Lincoln became a first-rate, highly sought-after lawyer. His courtroom style was distinctive. Speaking in a high, clear voice, he used simple language, often employing humor to relax the jury and make them receptive. But when the moment called for gravity, he could be powerfully eloquent, always searching for the moral question at the heart of the legal dispute. The Almanac case became legendary. Defending a man accused of murder, Lincoln used an almanac to prove that, contrary to the prosecution's star witness, the moon was nearly dark on the night in question, making it impossible to see the crime clearly from the claimed distance. The dramatic presentation of this evidence destroyed the witness's credibility and won an acquittal for his client. Principles and protest. Lincoln was also rising in the political sphere. Serving 4 terms in the legislature, he became one of the Whig Party's key leaders in the state. He deeply believed in Henry Clay's American system, a vision that promoted social mobility by using government to fund internal improvements, like roads and canals, creating economic opportunity for people like himself. His most consequential action during this period, however, involved slavery. While his family had always opposed the institution, and Lincoln himself had been deeply disturbed by what he saw in New Orleans, he had remained cautious as a young politician. In the 1830s, the fierce debates over abolition were intensifying. In 1837, the Illinois legislature passed resolutions condemning abolitionist societies and affirming the right of Southern states to maintain slavery. Only 6 members voted against the resolutions. Lincoln was one of them. He then drafted a protest with a fellow legislator, which stated that while they recognized Congress had no power to interfere with slavery in the existing Southern states, they believed the institution was founded on both injustice and bad policy. It was a carefully balanced statement, morally uncompromising on the issue of injustice, yet pragmatic about the legal limits of federal power. It was the first time Lincoln took a stand that defined his conviction and separated him from the majority of his colleagues. By 1842, Lincoln was established as a leading lawyer and a rising political star. He was respected, admired, and earning a decent living. But he remained restless. At 33, the brilliant, self-made man was still living in a room above a store, unmarried, and awkward around women. He seemed destined for bachelorhood. But his personal life was about to become as complicated and consequential as his professional career. He was about to meet a woman who would challenge him, exasperate him, and ultimately share in his highest destiny. Her name was Mary Todd, and she would change everything. The ambitious young politician was emerging, but the final, most crucial element of his life was about to walk into it. Chapter 4, Love and Marriage. Mary Todd Lincoln, 1840–1842. In the winter of 1839, a young woman arrived in Springfield who would forever alter the course of Abraham Lincoln's life. Her name was Mary Ann Todd, and she was the embodiment of the Eastern aristocracy he had never known. Mary was 21, well-educated, and from one of Kentucky's most prominent, slaveholding families. She had been raised in a mansion in Lexington, attending fine schools, learning French, literature, and the social graces expected of the wealthy. She came to live with her sister, Elizabeth Edwards, in the most fashionable part of Springfield. Lincoln and Mary Todd could hardly have been more different in background. He had grown up in dirt-floor log cabins and split rails. She had been attended by enslaved servants. He was known for his rough clothes and frontier manners. She was polished, witty, and deeply cultured. Yet, they shared key traits. Both were fiercely intelligent, well-read, and loved poetry. Most importantly, both were profoundly ambitious. Mary had grown up around power and was determined to marry a man destined for great things. Lincoln, for his part, was drawn to Mary's intelligence, her social grace, and her political insight. They met at one of the many social gatherings at the Edwards home. Lincoln, despite his growing legal fame, was still physically awkward and self-conscious in refined society. But when he talked with Mary, something clicked. She saw past his ungainly appearance to the sharp mind and good heart beneath. She laughed at his jokes and engaged his ideas seriously. Mary was vivacious and charming, but she was also high-strung, with a temper that could flare and a sharp tongue when crossed. She suffered from headaches and intense mood swings. Lincoln found himself drawn to this captivating, complicated woman in a way he had never experienced. The broken vow. Their courtship was turbulent from the start. Mary's family thought Lincoln was beneath her socially. He was poor, without family connections, and lacked polish. They made their disapproval painfully clear. Lincoln himself was deeply conflicted. He was attracted to Mary, but terrified of marriage. He struggled with bouts of profound melancholy, what we would now call depression, and he feared binding any woman to his dark, uncertain nature. As his friend Joshua Speed observed, Lincoln's biggest fear was that he would make his wife unhappy. Despite his doubts, they became engaged in 1840. But as their wedding day approached, Lincoln's anxieties overwhelmed him. On January 1, 1841, a day he would later call that fatal 1st of January, Lincoln broke off the engagement. He immediately fell into one of the worst depressions of his life. He was so miserable, friends feared for his sanity. He wrote to his law partner, "I am now the most miserable man living." He was tormented by guilt, knowing he had hurt Mary badly and humiliated her publicly in the small town. Slowly, he recovered, throwing himself into his work. They avoided each other for over a year, but mutual friends worked quietly to bring about a reconciliation. In the late summer of 1842, they met again and discovered their feelings had not died. This time, Lincoln was certain. He was 33, established in his career, and ready. A complicated union. On November 4, 1842, Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd were married. The ceremony was so hastily arranged that it took place in the parlor of the Edwards home with only a few hours' notice. When the minister asked the groom if he took Mary with any reservations, Lincoln reportedly replied, with his characteristic honesty, "With no reservations," drawing chuckles from the small group present. The marriage was, by all accounts, complicated. Lincoln was calm, patient, and frugal. Mary was volatile, extravagant, and high-strung. She suffered from a temper that could send her into rages. She was known to throw objects, and servants rarely lasted long in the Lincoln household. But Lincoln bore her outbursts with remarkable patience and understanding. He recognized that her temper was something she could not fully control. He would quietly leave the house during her rages, walking around Springfield until she calmed down. He never publicly spoke ill of his wife, maintaining fierce loyalty and discretion. For all the conflict, the bond was genuine. They loved each other, sharing intellectual interests, discussing politics, and finding strength in mutual support. Lincoln called her Mother or Molly, she called him Mr. Lincoln. Crucially, Mary was Lincoln's most powerful political catalyst. She believed absolutely in his potential for greatness, even before he did. She pushed him to be more social, to polish his appearance, and to network with influential people. She was his relentless political advisor, offering keen insight into the personalities and motivations of allies and opponents. Mary was, in many ways, Lincoln's first political strategist. 9 months after their marriage, on August 1, 1843, their first child, Robert Todd Lincoln, was born. Over the next 10 years, 3 more sons would follow: Edward Eddie Baker in 1846, William Willie Wallace in 1850, and Thomas Tad in 1853. Lincoln was a doting, indulgent father who adored his boys, letting them run wild through the house and his law office. The family tragedy that would bind them forever struck in December 1849. Little Eddie, not yet 4 years old, fell ill and died on February 1, 1850, likely from tuberculosis. Mary was prostrate with grief, unable to function for weeks. Lincoln grieved deeply but quietly. This shared loss, this searing pain, became an invisible, profound bond between the two complicated souls. Mary's temper, extravagance, and mental health struggles were constant challenges, but she never wavered in her belief. She provided the home, bore the children, and offered the crucial ambition and political guidance he required. Without Mary, Lincoln might well have settled for being a successful country lawyer. She saw his destiny and would not let him rest until he fulfilled it. As the 1850s began, the Lincolns were established in their Springfield home. But the nation itself was now starting to burn. The Whig Party was dying, and the question of slavery was growing more urgent and divisive. The ambition Mary had fostered in her husband would soon be called upon to serve a purpose far larger than either of them could imagine. They had endured their personal trials and faced their first tragedy. Together, they would now confront the destiny that lay ahead. Chapter 5, Congressman Lencioln National Stage Debut and the Great Awakening, 1846–1854. In August 1846, Abraham Lincoln achieved one of his greatest ambitions. He was elected to the United States House of Representatives. At 37, Lincoln had finally won a seat in Congress through a Whig Party agreement to rotate the candidacy. Mary was ecstatic. This was the national platform she had always known he deserved. In October 1847, the Lincoln family, Abraham, Mary, 4-year-old Robert, and infant Eddie, made the long, challenging journey from Springfield to Washington, D.C. They arrived in a city of jarring contrasts. Grand government buildings stood amid muddy, unpaved streets. Most disturbing to Lincoln was the city's open display of human bondage. Washington was a slave city. Enslaved people worked in hotels and government buildings, and were marched in chains to slave markets. For Lincoln, seeing slavery operate openly in the nation's capital was deeply offensive. The Lincolns moved into a crowded boarding house on Capitol Hill. Mary found Washington society intimidating and the conditions difficult. She had hoped to shine in the capital's social circles, but felt isolated and out of place. After a few months, she took the children and returned to Kentucky, leaving Lincoln to serve his term alone. The spot resolutions. Lincoln took his seat in the House of Representatives in December 1847, just as the nation was consumed by the Mexican-American War. The war had begun in 1846 after President James K. Polk, a Democrat, claimed that American troops had been attacked on American soil. Many Whigs believed Polk had deliberately provoked the conflict to seize Mexican land and expand slavery. Lincoln shared these suspicions. He genuinely believed the war was unjust and unconstitutional, started by the president through deception. Shortly after taking his seat, Lincoln introduced what became known as the spot resolutions. These resolutions formally demanded that President Polk identify the exact spot where American blood had been shed on clearly American soil, as Polk had claimed. Lincoln was directly challenging the president's honesty and the war's legitimacy, standing up for constitutional limits on executive power. Lincoln followed up with a detailed speech on the House floor, accusing Polk of a bewildered, confounded, and miserably perplexed understanding of the situation. He was principled and courageous, taking an unpopular stand against a winning war, but politically, the stand was disastrous. The war was popular, especially in Illinois. To many back home, Lincoln's opposition looked like disloyalty to American troops. Democrats attacked him viciously, and even fellow Whigs thought he had gone too far. The damage was immediate and severe. Lincoln served out his term, introducing moderate bills, including one to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia with compensation, but he had become too controversial. True to the Whig agreement, he did not seek re-election. In March 1849, his congressional service ended. He returned to Illinois hoping for a patronage appointment in the new Whig administration, but his opposition to the war had made him a political liability. The appointment never came. Lincoln's debut on the national stage had ended in failure. The wilderness years. Lincoln threw himself back into his law practice with renewed energy. He had been away from the circuit for 2 years, and he needed to rebuild his practice and his finances. He traveled the circuit with dedication, re-establishing himself as one of Illinois' premier lawyers. The early 1850s became Lincoln's wilderness years. He focused on his family, mourning the death of his son Eddie in 1850 and welcoming the births of Willie and Tad. He followed politics, but he seemed resigned to being a successful but politically insignificant lawyer in Springfield, yet, he watched the national crisis with mounting alarm. The Compromise of 1850 had provided a temporary truce, but it included the morally repugnant fugitive slave law. Lincoln accepted the compromise as the necessary price of preserving the Union. His central position remained clear: the Constitution protected slavery where it already existed, but slavery must be prevented from spreading into new territories. As long as it was contained, he believed, it would eventually die out. Pro-slavery forces, however, were not content with containment. They wanted expansion, and their champion was Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, a Democrat with immense ambition and political skill. The Great Awakening in 1854, everything changed. Senator Douglas introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This bill would organize the Kansas and Nebraska territories and allow the settlers in each to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery, a doctrine called popular sovereignty. The bill had a devastating implication: it would repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had prohibited slavery in territories north of the $36-circ 30-foot parallel. The Kansas-Nebraska Act would open vast territories to slavery that had been closed to it for more than 30 years. The bill outraged many Northerners, including Abraham Lincoln. The Missouri Compromise had been a sacred, foundational agreement maintaining sectional peace. To tear it up was a moral catastrophe and a betrayal of the nation's founding principles. Lincoln later said that the Kansas-Nebraska Act awakened him as he had never been before. The old passion for politics came flooding back, driven now by a moral fire deeper than personal ambition. This was about the fundamental character of the nation, whether America would be defined by freedom and opportunity, or whether slavery would spread and dominate the entire country. Lincoln began speaking out against the act wherever he could find an audience. He traveled across Illinois, arguing that slavery was morally wrong, that it violated the principles of the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, and that its expansion would corrupt the entire nation. He was not yet an abolitionist, but he insisted that slavery must not be allowed to expand. It must be placed, as he said, in the course of ultimate extinction. In Peoria in October 1854, Lincoln gave one of the most important speeches of his career, laying out his case against expansion. His logic was rigorous, his language plain, and his moral vision compelling. The speech was powerful, persuasive, and printed widely across Illinois. The Kansas-Nebraska Act passed and was signed into law. Its consequence was immediate and terrible: settlers rushed into Kansas, and violence erupted. Bleeding Kansas became a preview of the larger Civil War to come. The Whig Party, unable to withstand the sectional crisis, collapsed. A new party, the Republicans, formed specifically around the opposition to slavery's expansion. For Abraham Lincoln, now 45 years old, the time for quiet law practice was over. The principles he had always believed in were under existential threat. Everything he had learned, his legal logic, his oratorical skill, his proven character, would now be required. The crisis was building. The nation was fracturing. And Abraham Lincoln, the self-educated lawyer awakened to his purpose, was about to step into the center of the stage. Chapter 6: The Return to Politics. The slavery question intensifies, 1854 to 1858. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 was not just a new law, it was a political earthquake that shook Abraham Lincoln out of his semi-retirement. For years, the slavery issue had been managed through fragile compromises. But when Senator Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln's longtime rival from Illinois, pushed this act through Congress, it repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Suddenly, vast northern territories that had been closed to slavery for 30 years were thrown open to it, subject only to popular sovereignty, the vote of the settlers. To Lincoln, this was a moral catastrophe. It transformed him. The quiet lawyer who had resigned himself to private life vanished. In his place emerged a relentless, impassioned voice for the nation's conscience. He began traveling across Illinois, speaking wherever he could find an audience, from courthouse steps to country churches. His message was laser-focused: slavery was not just an economic system or a states' rights issue, it was a moral wrong. He argued that if the principles of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, were tossed aside for black men, they would eventually be tossed aside for white men, too. As Lincoln later said, the act had awakened him as he had never been before. The birth of the Republicans. As Lincoln spoke, the political ground beneath him was shifting. The old Whig Party, unable to cope with the slavery crisis, collapsed. In its place, a new coalition was forming, the Republican Party, united by a single, burning principle: opposition to the expansion of slavery. Lincoln was cautious at first. He feared the new party might be too radical, filled with abolitionists who wanted immediate, perhaps violent, change. He also despised the know-nothing elements, nativists who hated immigrants, that were flirting with the new party. But by 1856, the choice was clear. The battle lines were drawn, and Lincoln threw his lot in with the Republicans, quickly becoming the architect of the party in Illinois. He spent 2 years building the organization, recruiting candidates, and refining the arguments that would unite moderates and radicals alike. He was no longer just a participant in politics, he was a leader. A house divided. In 1858, the Illinois Republicans did something unprecedented: they formally nominated Abraham Lincoln to run for the U.S. Senate against Stephen A. Douglas. Douglas was no ordinary opponent. Known as the Little Giant, he was perhaps the most famous politician in America, a man with immense wealth, a booming voice, and a legitimate path to the presidency. Challenging him seemed like political suicide. On June 16, 1858, Lincoln accepted the nomination in Springfield. He delivered a speech that his advisers had begged him not to give. They told him it was too radical, too dangerous. Lincoln ignored them. He believed the time for safe platitudes was over. A house divided against itself cannot stand, Lincoln declared. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved, I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. The speech was a lightning rod. Douglas immediately pounced, accusing Lincoln of wanting to incite a civil war. But Lincoln had framed the election not as a choice between two men, but as a choice between two futures. The Great Debates. Lincoln challenged Douglas to a series of debates, and confident in his own prowess, Douglas agreed. They met 7 times between August and October 1858, in towns across Illinois: Ottawa, Freeport, Jonesboro, Charleston, Galesburg, Quincy, and Alton. These were not polite, academic affairs. They were raucous, sweating, dusty political festivals. In towns of a few thousand, crowds of 10,000 to 15,000 people would gather. They stood for hours in the sweltering heat, jostling for position while brass bands played and cannons fired. The contrast between the two men was theatrical. Douglas was short, barely 5'4", but barrel-chested and impeccably dressed in plantation finery. He exuded power and aggression. Lincoln was 6'4", lanky, and awkward, his trousers always a bit too short, his clothes rumpled. When he began to speak, his voice was high and reedy, almost shrill. But as he warmed to his subject, his awkwardness vanished, replaced by a burning, logical intensity that mesmerized the crowds. Douglas's strategy was brutal and effective. He played to the deep racial prejudices of the Illinois voters. He painted Lincoln as a dangerous radical who wanted Negro equality, warning white voters that Lincoln would bring about a world where black men would vote, serve on juries, and marry white women. Lincoln was forced to walk a razor's edge. He knew that if he advocated for full social equality, he would lose the election instantly. In moments that are painful to read today, he denied supporting black voting rights or intermarriage. Yet, he never retreated from the core moral truth. He insisted, over and over, that the black man was entitled to the natural rights listed in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In the right to eat the bread, without the leave of anybody else, which his own hand earns, Lincoln thundered, "He is my equal and the equal of Judge Douglas, and the equal of every living man." The trap at Freeport. The most pivotal moment came at the debate in Freeport. Lincoln asked Douglas a carefully crafted question: could the people of a territory lawfully exclude slavery before they became a state? It was a trap. The Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision said no, slavery could not be banned in the territories. If Douglas said no, he would outrage the anti-slavery voters of Illinois and lose the Senate seat. If he said yes, he would defy the Supreme Court and enrage the pro-slavery South. Douglas tried to thread the needle. He answered yes, arguing that settlers could simply refuse to pass the local police laws needed to enforce slavery. This became known as the Freeport Doctrine. It was a clever legal evasion that saved him in Illinois, but it was a fatal error for his national ambitions. Southern Democrats viewed it as a betrayal. Lincoln had lost the battle, but he had maneuvered Douglas into losing the war. Victory in defeat. The election day in November 1858 brought a bittersweet result. Because senators were chosen by the state legislature, not the popular vote, the outcome depended on which party won the local districts. Lincoln's Republican candidates actually received more votes overall, 125,000 to Douglas's 121,000. But the districts were drawn in a way that favored the Democrats. Douglas retained his Senate seat. Lincoln was deeply disappointed. He wrote to a friend that he felt, like the boy that stumped his toe, it hurt too bad to laugh, and he was too big to cry. He believed his political career was over. "I now sink out of view, and shall be forgotten," he predicted. He was wrong. The debates had been transcribed and printed in newspapers across the entire country. The nation had watched the obscure prairie lawyer go toe-to-toe with the most powerful Democrat in the land and hold his own. They saw a man of wit, logic, and unshakable moral conviction. Far from sinking out of view, Lincoln was in high demand. In the months following the defeat, invitations to speak poured in from Ohio, Indiana, Kansas, and Wisconsin. He began to craft a new image, not just as an Illinois lawyer, but as the intellectual leader of the Republican cause. He began to see a path that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The Republican Party would need a candidate for president in 1860, someone moderate enough to carry the border states, but principled enough to energize the anti-slavery base. Abraham Lincoln, the giant killer who had lost the Senate race but won the moral argument, was ready to step onto the national stage. The election of 1860 was approaching, and the fate of the Union was hanging by a thread. Chapter 7: The Path to the Presidency. The election of 1860. In the freezing early months of 1860, Abraham Lincoln began an audacious maneuver. He began quietly positioning himself for the Republican presidential nomination. To the political establishment, the idea was laughable. The frontrunner was William Henry Seward of New York, a titan of the Senate with a powerful political machine. Compared to him, Lincoln was a one-term congressman who had lost his only Senate race. But Lincoln had hidden advantages. He was from Illinois, a critical swing state. He was moderate enough not to terrify the border states, yet firm enough on slavery to satisfy the base. And he had a strategy: let the heavyweights knock each other out, and be everyone's second choice. The Cooper Union moment. His first test came on February 27, 1860, in New York City. Lincoln was invited to speak at the Cooper Union, a prestigious venue filled with the Eastern elite. He prepared exhaustively. Standing before 1,500 skeptics, the prairie lawyer delivered a masterclass in history and logic. He didn't use fiery rhetoric, he used cold facts. He proved that the Founding Fathers believed the federal government had the power to control slavery in the territories, dismantling the South's constitutional arguments. He concluded with a line that rang like a bell: "Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us, to the end, dare to do our duty as we understand it." The speech was a sensation. Overnight, Lincoln transformed from a Western curiosity into a serious national contender. The Wigwam. The Republican National Convention was held in May in Chicago, inside a massive, temporary wooden structure called the Wigwam, capable of holding 10,000 screaming partisans. Seward arrived expecting a coronation. But Lincoln's managers, David Davis and Norman Judd, were waging a guerrilla war for delegates. They packed the hall with Lincoln supporters, even printing counterfeit tickets to keep Seward's men out, and worked the backrooms, trading cabinet posts for votes. On May 18, the balloting began. First ballot, Seward led with 173.5 votes to Lincoln's 102. Second ballot, momentum shifted. Pennsylvania broke for Lincoln. The tally tightened: Seward 184.5, Lincoln 181. Third ballot, the dam broke. When the final tally was announced, the hall erupted in a noise so deafening that a cannon fired on the roof could barely be heard. Abraham Lincoln, the dark horse, was the nominee. In Springfield, Lincoln received the telegram. He walked home to Mary, the woman who had always believed this day would come, and said simply, "I reckon there's a little woman down on 8th Street who'd like to hear this news." A nation of fragments. The general election was a four-way chaotic fracture. The Democrats split in two: Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas, Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge. A fourth party, the Constitutional Unionists, nominated John Bell. Lincoln stayed in Springfield, maintaining a dignified silence, while the South burned with rumors that he was a radical abolitionist intent on destroying their way of life. On November 6, 1860, the results came in. The numbers revealed a nation already broken. Abraham Lincoln, Republican 1,865,908 votes, winning 180 electoral votes. Stephen Douglas, Northern Democrat 1,380,202 votes, but only 12 electoral votes. John Breckinridge, Southern Democrat 848,019 votes, winning 72 electoral votes. John Bell, Constitutional Union 590,901 votes, winning 39 electoral votes. Lincoln had won the presidency with less than 40% of the popular vote. In 10 Southern states, he received 0 votes. He was the legally elected president, but he was the president of a ghost. The secession winter. The reaction was instant. On December 20, South Carolina seceded. By February, 6 more states, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, had followed. They formed the Confederate States of America and elected Jefferson Davis as their president. Washington, D.C. was paralyzed. The outgoing president, James Buchanan, watched helplessly as federal forts were seized. Lincoln, still in Springfield, watched in agony. He formed his cabinet, a team of rivals, including Seward and Chase, but he was powerless to act until March. In February 1861, he boarded a train for Washington. At the station, he bid an emotional farewell to his neighbors. "Here I have lived a quarter of a century. Here my children have been born, and one is buried. I now leave, not knowing when, or whether ever, I may return." The journey was shadowed by death. Detective Alan Pinkerton uncovered a credible plot to assassinate Lincoln in Baltimore. Lincoln was forced to sneak through the city in the dead of night, arriving in Washington like a fugitive rather than a conqueror. The first inaugural. March 4, 1861, was a cold, overcast day. The Capitol was surrounded by sharpshooters, the air was thick with the threat of violence. As Lincoln rose to speak, he looked for a place to put his silk hat. Stephen Douglas, his old rival, the man he had defeated, stepped forward and held it for him. A silent gesture of unity in a shattering world. Lincoln's speech was a desperate plea for peace. He spoke to the South, promising not to interfere with slavery where it existed, but refusing to accept the legality of secession. He ended with poetry that still echoes through history. "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. The mystic chords of memory will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." It was a beautiful prayer. But it was too late. The better angels had fled. Abraham Lincoln was now the 16th President of the United States. He was 52 years old. And as he took the oath, the country he swore to protect was already gone. Chapter 8, The Storm Breaks. The Civil War begins, 1861 to 1862. Abraham Lincoln had been president for barely a month when the crisis became unavoidable. Fort Sumter, a federal island fortress in Charleston Harbor, was running out of food. The small garrison was surrounded by Confederate cannons. Lincoln faced an impossible choice: if he sent supplies, the South would view it as an act of war. If he abandoned the fort, he would be recognizing the Confederacy as a legitimate nation, betraying his oath of office. He agonized over the decision, engaging in sleepless nights and fierce debates with a divided cabinet. Finally, he chose a masterstroke of strategy: he would send only food, not ammunition or troops, and he would warn South Carolina in advance. He forced the Confederates to make the choice: allow the humanitarian aid, or open fire on bread. They chose fire. At 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery erupted. For 34 hours, shells rained down on the fort. Remarkably, no one was killed, but the fort was reduced to rubble. The Union garrison surrendered, and the Confederate flag rose over the harbor. The Civil War had begun. The 90-day illusion. The attack electrified the North. The firing on the flag swept away all hesitation. Lincoln immediately issued a proclamation calling for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 90 days to suppress the rebellion. 90 days. That is how long Lincoln and his advisors thought the war would last. It was a catastrophic underestimate. They were embarking on a conflict that would last 4 years and claim 750,000 lives. The call for troops triggered a second wave of secession. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina left the Union. Virginia's defection was devastating. It moved the Confederate border to the Potomac River, right across from Washington, D.C., and brought with it Robert E. Lee, the finest officer in the Army, who chose loyalty to his state over his country. The border state tightrope. Now, Lincoln played the most dangerous poker game of his life. For slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, remained in the Union. These border states were vital. If Maryland seceded, Washington, D.C. would be completely surrounded by enemy territory. If Kentucky seceded, the Ohio River would become a Confederate highway. Lincoln used every tool he had, diplomacy, patience, and raw military power, to keep them. In Maryland, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus, allowing the military to arrest secessionists without charge. It was constitutionally questionable, but Lincoln argued that he could not let the Constitution perish by adhering too strictly to one single law. In Kentucky, he played a waiting game. "I hope to have God on my side," he reportedly said, "but I must have Kentucky." Through a mix of political maneuvering and luck, Kentucky remained loyal. The reality of war. By July 1861, the public was clamoring for action. Newspapers screamed, "On to Richmond." Under immense pressure, Lincoln ordered the army to march into Virginia. Civilians, expecting a spectacle, rode out in carriages with picnic baskets to watch the battle near a creek called Bull Run. It was a disaster. Confederate forces, led by an immovable general named Thomas "Stonewall" Jackson, broke the Union lines. The retreat turned into a panicked rout. Soldiers threw down their guns and ran, mixing with the terrified civilians in a chaotic stampede back to Washington. The illusion of a short, easy war died that day. Lincoln received the news with a strange, stony calm. He did not panic. He began planning for a long war. He appointed a young, brilliant organizer named George B. McClellan to build a real army. McClellan created the Army of the Potomac, a magnificent fighting machine, but he had a fatal flaw: he was terrified to use it. The team of rivals. Lincoln's leadership was tested daily by his own cabinet. Secretary of State William Seward initially thought he would run the country, treating Lincoln like a simpleton. But Lincoln, with gentle firmness, established his authority. Seward soon became his closest friend and advisor. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was different. He was rude, abrasive, and openly critical of Lincoln. But he was also tirelessly efficient. When friends asked why Lincoln tolerated Stanton's disrespect, Lincoln replied simply, "I need him. He fights." Lincoln managed these massive egos with humor and humility, absorbing the stress so his government wouldn't break. Tragedy in the White House. But the war was not the only storm breaking over the president. In February 1862, Lincoln's beloved 11-year-old son, Willie, fell ill with typhoid fever. Willie was the favorite, bright, sensitive, and kind. As the boy grew weaker, Lincoln spent hours at his bedside, his large hand holding his son's small one, while the telegrams of war piled up outside the door. On February 20th, Willie died. Lincoln broke down completely. "My poor boy," he sobbed. "He was too good for this earth." Mary Lincoln was destroyed. She collapsed into a grief so profound she could not even attend the funeral. Lincoln had to grieve while leading a nation in flames. He would wander into Willie's room at night to weep alone, then wash his face and return to the war room. Blood and iron. The war turned darker. In April 1862, at the Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee, the Union won a victory under General Ulysses S. Grant, but at a horrifying cost: 23,000 casualties in 2 days, more than all previous American wars combined. The slaughter forced Lincoln to confront a terrifying truth: this war would not end until the South was broken completely. And he began to realize that the root cause, slavery, could no longer be ignored. He had spent the first year of the war trying to save the Union without touching slavery, to keep the border states calm. But the scale of the death was changing the moral calculus. He began to see that a war fought for the Union alone was not enough. It needed a higher purpose. As 1862 dragged on, the inexperienced prairie lawyer was gone. In his place stood a hardened war president, forged in fire and sorrow. He was preparing to take a step that would change history. He sat at his desk, drafting a document that would transform the Civil War from a political dispute into a holy crusade for human freedom. The storm had broken, but the lightning was just about to strike. Chapter 9, Emancipation. Transforming the War's Purpose, 1862 to 1863. By the summer of 1862, Abraham Lincoln had reached a conclusion that would alter the course of human history: the Union could not win the war without striking at its root. Slavery. It was a calculation born of both moral conviction and cold military necessity. Lincoln had always believed slavery was wrong, but he had also believed his constitutional power was limited. But the war had changed everything. Nearly 4 million enslaved people were the engine of the Confederate economy. They grew the food, built the fortifications, and sustained the rebellion while white men went off to fight. Lincoln realized that to defeat the South, he had to liberate its labor force. There was also a diplomatic gun to his head. Britain and France were watching closely, considering recognizing the Confederacy as an independent nation. However, both nations despised slavery. Lincoln knew that if he could transform the war from a political dispute into a moral crusade for freedom, Europe would never dare intervene on the side of the South. But the politics were treacherous. The loyal border states, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri, still allowed slavery. If Lincoln moved too fast, they might bolt to the Confederacy, and the war would be lost. If he moved too slow, his own party would revolt. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass were already criticizing him for his caution. In August, Horace Greeley, the powerful editor of the New York Tribune, published an open letter demanding action. Lincoln replied with a masterfully calibrated public statement, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave I would do it, and if I could save it by freeing all the slaves I would do it." It sounded like he was neutral. He wasn't. He was preparing the public. In the secret drawer of his desk, a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation was already waiting. He just needed a victory to announce it, so it wouldn't look like the desperate act of a losing government. The bloodiest day. He needed a victory, but the Union armies were floundering. Then, fortune smiled. In September 1862, as Robert E. Lee launched an invasion of Maryland, a Union soldier found a copy of Lee's secret orders wrapped around 3 cigars dropped by a Confederate officer. Armed with these plans, the Union Army moved to intercept Lee. On September 17, 1862, the two vast forces collided at Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg, Maryland. It was the bloodiest single day in American history. For 12 hours, the fighting raged across cornfields that were mowed down by bullets as effectively as by scythes. They fought in a sunken road that filled so deep with bodies it became known as Bloody Lane. By nightfall, over 22,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. The battle was a tactical stalemate, but Lee was forced to retreat back to Virginia. It wasn't a decisive triumph, but it was enough for Lincoln. 5 days later, on September 22, he summoned his cabinet. He opened the meeting by reading a funny chapter from a book of humor by Artemus Ward, baffling his somber secretaries. Then, his tone shifted to steel. He told them he had made a promise to God that if Lee was driven back, he would act. He read them the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It was an ultimatum: the Confederacy had 100 days to return to the Union. If they did not, on January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in the rebellious states would be, thenceforward, and forever free. The Great Proclamation. The 100-day waiting period was agonizing. The fall elections went badly for Republicans. Lincoln was plagued by nightmares. But he held firm. On the morning of January 1, 1863, the final document lay on his desk. Lincoln dipped his pen, but his hand was trembling, not from fear, but because he had spent hours shaking hands at a New Year's reception. He paused, putting the pen down. "If my name ever goes into history," he said, "it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it. If my hand trembles when I sign the proclamation, all who examine the document hereafter will say, 'He hesitated.'" He waited a moment, steadied his hand, and signed firmly, "Abraham Lincoln." The proclamation was a legal masterpiece. It did not free slaves in the loyal border states or occupied Tennessee. Lincoln still needed their support. It applied only to the enemy. But its impact was revolutionary. It fundamentally changed the legal status of millions of people from property to human in the eyes of the federal government. Most radically, the document authorized the recruitment of black soldiers. The response was electric. Frederick Douglass traveled the North recruiting volunteers, including 2 of his own sons. By the war's end, approximately 179,000 black men served in the Union Army, making up roughly 10% of the entire force. They fought in segregated units, initially for lower pay, $10 a month versus $13 for whites, and faced the threat of execution or enslavement if captured. Yet they fought with ferocious courage. At places like Fort Wagner and Port Hudson, they proved to the nation that they had earned their citizenship in blood. The war had become a new birth of freedom. The high water mark. But proclamations do not win battles. The war ground on, and Lincoln continued his desperate search for a general who could beat Robert E. Lee. In the summer of 1863, emboldened by recent victories, Lee decided to gamble everything. He launched a massive invasion of the North, marching into Pennsylvania. He hoped a victory on Northern soil would break the Union's will and force a negotiated peace. The 2 great armies crashed into each other almost by accident, meeting at a crossroads town called Gettysburg. For 3 days in July, the fate of the nation hung in the balance. Day 1, the Union forces were driven back through the town, rallying on the high ground of Cemetery Hill. Day 2, the fighting swirled around crucial points: Little Round Top, the wheat field, the peach orchard. The Union line bent, but it did not break. Day 3, Lee made his fatal mistake. He ordered a massive frontal assault against the center of the Union line. At 3 p.m. on July 3, nearly 13,000 Confederate soldiers, led by General George Pickett, stepped out of the woods. They marched across a mile of open fields into a storm of Union artillery and rifle fire. It was magnificent, and it was suicidal. The attack, known as Pickett's Charge, was decimated. Lee's army was broken. He retreated back to Virginia, never to invade the North again. At almost the exact same moment, 1,000 miles away, General Ulysses S. Grant captured the fortress city of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. The Confederacy was cut in 2. July 1863 was the turning point. The sun was beginning to set on the rebellion. The Gettysburg Address. In November 1863, a cemetery was dedicated at Gettysburg to honor the 50,000 men who had fallen there. The organizers invited Edward Everett, the most famous orator in America, to give the main speech. Almost as an afterthought, they asked the president to offer a few appropriate remarks. Everett spoke for 2 hours. He gave a brilliant, classical oration detailing the history of the battle. Then, Abraham Lincoln rose. He wore a black suit and a steel-rimmed pair of spectacles. He held a single sheet of paper. He spoke for 2 minutes. In just 272 words, Lincoln redefined the meaning of the United States. He did not speak of the battle's details. He did not mention the South, or the enemy, or slavery by name. Instead, he reached back to the Declaration of Independence, insisting that the nation was conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He transformed the war from a legal struggle over the Constitution into a spiritual test of democracy itself. He called on the living to finish the work of the dead, to ensure that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. When he sat down, the applause was scattered. Lincoln felt he had failed. "That speech won't scour," he told a friend, using an old farming term for a plow that wouldn't clean itself of dirt. He was wrong. Edward Everett wrote to him the next day, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours, as you did in 2 minutes." The boy from the log cabin had become the moral father of the nation. The war would drag on for 2 more bloody years, but the purpose was now clear. It was no longer a war just to save a map, it was a war to save the human spirit. Chapter 10, Leadership in Crisis. The grinding war continues, 1863 to 1864. After 3 years of disappointment with generals who wouldn't fight, Abraham Lincoln finally found his man. Ulysses S. Grant was an unlikely hero. He was quiet, unassuming, rumpled, and plagued by rumors of alcoholism. But Grant possessed the one quality Lincoln desperately needed. He understood that the war would not be won by capturing cities, but by destroying Confederate armies. In March 1864, Lincoln promoted Grant to lieutenant general, a rank previously held only by George Washington. When Grant arrived in Washington, the president and the general formed a partnership that would save the Union. Lincoln urged him on, famously saying of Grant's critics, "I can't spare this man. He fights." The strategy of total war. Grant devised a brutal, coordinated strategy. He would stay in Virginia and lock Robert E. Lee in a death grip, refusing to let go. Meanwhile, General William Tecumseh Sherman would drive south from Tennessee into Georgia, smashing the Confederate heartland. It was a strategy of total war. The goal was not just to defeat the enemy's army, but to break the enemy's will to resist. In May 1864, Grant crossed the Rapidan River into Virginia with 100,000 men. He plunged into a dense, tangled forest known as the Wilderness. What followed was 6 weeks of continuous, horrific slaughter. The woods caught fire, burning wounded men alive. At Cold Harbor, Union forces suffered 7,000 casualties in 20 minutes. The casualty reports arriving on Lincoln's desk were staggering. In just 6 weeks, the Union lost 55,000 men, roughly half the Army's strength. Northern newspapers branded Grant the Butcher. Politicians demanded his removal. But Lincoln stood firm. He noticed the difference. Previous generals, after suffering such losses, would have retreated. Grant did not. After every battle, Grant gave the order to march south. When the soldiers realized they were advancing toward Richmond rather than retreating, they cheered. The political abyss. Lincoln understood the terrible arithmetic: the North could replace its losses, the South could not. But the political cost was agonizing. By the summer of 1864, the war seemed stalled. Grant was bogged down in a siege at Petersburg. Sherman was stuck outside Atlanta. War weariness settled over the North like a fog. The Democrats nominated George McClellan, the general Lincoln had fired, on a platform declaring the war a failure. They promised a negotiated peace, which meant the Union would likely be permanently divided and slavery preserved. Lincoln was convinced he would lose. In August, he wrote a sealed memo to his cabinet, pledging to cooperate with the president-elect to save the Union before the inauguration. He was preparing to sacrifice his own power to save the country. Then, the miracle happened. On September 2, 1864, a telegram arrived from Georgia. "Atlanta is ours, and fairly won." Sherman had taken the industrial hub of the South. The news revitalized the North. The sense of inevitable victory returned. The mandate. On November 8, 1864, the nation voted. Lincoln waited anxiously in the telegraph office. The result was a landslide. Lincoln won 212 electoral votes to McClellan's 21. Most remarkably, the soldiers in the field, the men eating the bad food and dying in the mud, voted for Lincoln by a margin of 78%. They had seen the cost of war, and they voted to finish the job. Emboldened, Lincoln pushed for the final destruction of the Confederacy. Sherman launched his famous March to the Sea, cutting a 60-mile-wide swath of destruction across Georgia. He destroyed railroads, burned crops, and freed thousands of enslaved people, proving the Confederacy could no longer protect its own citizens. On December 22, Sherman offered Lincoln the city of Savannah as a Christmas gift. Malice toward none. As the end of the war approached, Lincoln's thoughts turned to healing. He looked like a walking ghost. He had lost 30 pounds, his face was a map of deep lines, and his eyes were haunted by the 600,000 dead. On March 4, 1865, under a gray, rainy sky, Lincoln delivered his second inaugural address. It was a short, theological reflection on the sin of slavery. He suggested that the war was God's punishment to both North and South for 250 years of human bondage. But he ended with a plea for mercy that stands as his spiritual legacy. With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace. That evening, at the White House reception, police stopped a black man from entering. It was Frederick Douglass. Lincoln saw him and called out, "Here comes my friend Douglass." He took Douglass's hand and asked for his opinion on the speech. "Mr. Lincoln," Douglass replied, "that was a sacred effort. The war was nearly over. The Union was preserved. But the hardest work, the work of peace, was just beginning." And Abraham Lincoln, standing at the pinnacle of his power and his humanity, was ready to lead it. Chapter 11, Victory and Tragedy. The End and a New Beginning, 1865. On the evening of April 2, 1865, a telegram arrived in Richmond that shattered the Confederacy. It was from Robert E. Lee. The lines had broken. Richmond could no longer be held. That night, the Confederate government fled. As they left, they set fire to warehouses to destroy supplies. The fires raged out of control, and by dawn, the capital of the Confederacy was a smoking ruin. Abraham Lincoln was nearby at City Point, Virginia. Against the frantic advice of his security detail, he decided to enter the captured city. On April 4, holding the hand of his 12-year-old son Todd, the president walked the streets of Richmond. The scene was biblical. The city was still smoldering, but the streets were filled with formerly enslaved people who had heard the great Emancipator was coming. They surrounded him, weeping, singing, and reaching out to touch his coat. Some fell to their knees in the dust. Lincoln, visibly moved but uncomfortable with worship, gently rebuked them. "Don't kneel to me," he said. "You must kneel to God only, and thank Him for the liberty you will enjoy hereafter." He walked to the Confederate White House and sat in Jefferson Davis's chair, not to gloat, but to reflect. The Union had held. The surrender. 5 days later, on April 9, the end came at a small village called Appomattox Courthouse. Robert E. Lee's army was surrounded, starving, and exhausted. Lee knew that further fighting was merely murder. He put on his finest dress uniform and rode to meet Ulysses S. Grant. The two men met in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house. The contrast was striking: Lee, tall and aristocratic in immaculate gray; Grant, mud-spattered and rumpled in a private's uniform with general's stars sewn on. But Grant, following Lincoln's instructions, offered terms of extraordinary generosity. There would be no trials for treason. Confederate officers could keep their sidearms. Soldiers could keep their horses and mules to work their family farms. They were simply told to lay down their rifles and go home. Lee was visibly moved. The two generals shook hands, and the Army of Northern Virginia ceased to exist. When the news hit Washington, the city exploded. Cannons boomed, strangers embraced in the streets, and a massive crowd gathered on the White House lawn calling for a speech. Lincoln appeared at the window. Instead of a triumphant oration, he asked the band to play "Dixie," saying that since the Union had captured the song, it belonged to everyone again. The last speech. On April 11, Lincoln gave his final public speech from the White House balcony. He spoke of Reconstruction, arguing that the South should be welcomed back with mercy, not vengeance. Crucially, for the first time, he publicly suggested that the right to vote should be extended to black men, specifically, the very intelligent, and those who serve our cause as soldiers. In the crowd below, a famous actor named John Wilkes Booth was listening. Booth was a Confederate fanatic and a white supremacist. When he heard Lincoln mention black voting rights, he turned to a companion and snarled, "That means nigger citizenship. Now, by God, I'll put him through." That is the last speech he will ever make. The final day. April 14, 1865, Good Friday, dawned with a feeling of profound relief. The war was over. Lincoln began the day with a cabinet meeting. General Grant was there, fresh from Appomattox. Lincoln spoke of the future, insisting again that there be no bloody work of executions or persecution of Confederate leaders. Enough lives have been sacrificed, he said. He wanted to heal the nation, not punish it. That afternoon, he took a carriage ride with Mary. It was a rare moment of intimacy. They talked about their future, about traveling to Europe, or perhaps California, once his term ended. Mary noticed his lifted spirits. "We must be more cheerful in the future," Lincoln told her, holding her hand. "Between the war and the loss of our darling Willie, we have been very miserable." That evening, they were scheduled to attend a play at Ford's Theatre, a British comedy called Our American Cousin. General Grant and his wife were invited but declined. The Grants caught a train to New Jersey to see their children. Instead, the Lincolns were joined by a young officer, Major Henry Rathbone, and his fiancée, Clara Harris. The assassination. The presidential party arrived late. The play stopped, the orchestra played "Hail to the Chief," and the audience cheered wildly. Lincoln bowed and took his seat in the flag-draped box on the right side of the stage. John Wilkes Booth knew the theater intimately. He knew the play by heart. He waited in the hallway, drilling a peephole into the door of the box so he could see the president's chair. He timed his entrance for Act 3, Scene 2, when a specific line was delivered that always resulted in loud laughter, calculating the noise would mask the sound of his shot. At 10:15 p.m., the laughter roared through the theater. Booth slipped into the box. He stepped up directly behind the president, raised a small Derringer pistol, and fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. Lincoln slumped forward instantly, losing consciousness. He never knew what happened. Major Rathbone lunged at the assassin. Booth dropped the pistol and drew a hunting knife, slashing Rathbone's arm to the bone. Booth then vaulted over the railing to the stage 12 feet below. His spur caught on the Treasury flag decorating the box, and he landed awkwardly, breaking his leg. Adrenaline masking the pain, Booth stood center stage, brandished the bloody knife, and shouted the motto of Virginia, "Sic semper tyrannis." Thus always to tyrants. He limped out the back door, mounted a waiting horse, and vanished into the night. The long night. Inside the theater, confusion turned to terror. Mary Lincoln's scream pierced the air, "They have killed the president." Doctors rushed to the box, but the wound was clearly mortal. The bullet had entered behind the left ear and lodged behind the right eye. They couldn't move him back to the White House over the bumpy cobblestones, so soldiers carried the dying president across the street to a modest boarding house owned by a tailor named William Peterson. They laid him diagonally across a bed that was too short for his 6'4" frame. Through the long, rainy night, the leaders of the government gathered in the small back bedroom. Cabinet members, generals, and senators stood vigil, helpless. Mary Lincoln would enter the room, weep uncontrollably, and have to be led away. Lincoln's breathing grew labored, but he never regained consciousness. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, the breathing stopped. The room fell silent. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, the man who had once called Lincoln a guerrilla, but had grown to love him, broke the silence with 6 words that became his epitaph. "Now he belongs to the ages. The nation mourns." The shock was absolute. In the North, the joy of victory instantly curdled into a grief deeper than anyone had ever known. In the South, many realized that their best hope for a lenient peace had just died. On April 21, a funeral train departed Washington, carrying the bodies of Abraham Lincoln and his son Willie, who had been disinterred to go home with his father. The train traveled 1,654 miles over 12 days, retracing in reverse the journey Lincoln had made to Washington 4 years earlier. It was the largest funeral in human history. 7 million people, nearly one-third of the entire population of the North, came out to see the train. In Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago, the casket was opened for public viewing. Hundreds of thousands waited in line for hours just for a glimpse of his face. But the most moving scenes were in the countryside. At 2 a.m., in the middle of nowhere, the train would pass bonfires lined with thousands of silent farmers, standing with their hats over their hearts. On May 4th, the train arrived in Springfield, Illinois. The city was draped in black. His old neighbors, his law partners, and the people who knew him when he was just a poor lawyer with big dreams, watched as he was laid to rest at Oak Ridge Cemetery. The boy from the log cabin had come home. Legacy. John Wilkes Booth was hunted down and killed 12 days after the assassination, cornered in a burning barn in Virginia. But his bullet could not kill Lincoln's work. Abraham Lincoln had lived only 56 years. He had entered the presidency with the country breaking apart, and he left it stitched back together. He had taken a war that began over borders and turned it into a war for human rights. He had freed 4 million people and proven that a government, of the people, by the people, for the people, could survive the fire. The nation would struggle for another century to fully live up to the promises he made. But he had pointed the way. He had shown what America could be. And in saving the Union, he had saved the hope of democracy for the world. Chapter 12, Legacy. The Immortal Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's death, on Good Friday 1865, instantly transformed him from a controversial politician into an American martyr and a national saint. The man who had been constantly attacked, called a tyrant by some, a slow-moving abolitionist by others, suddenly became the savior of the Union and the great emancipator. The immediate impact was a unified wave of national grief. The funeral train journey became a pilgrimage of mourning, as millions gathered to honor a man they now recognized as extraordinary. The criticism that plagued his life was forgotten. The tragedy of Reconstruction. But his death carried tragic consequences for the nation. The generous, merciful Reconstruction Lincoln had envisioned never happened. His successor, Andrew Johnson, lacked Lincoln's political skill and moral commitment to racial justice. Johnson fought constantly with a Republican Congress that was pushing for civil rights for the freed people. Without Lincoln's genius for coalition building and timing, the process descended into bitterness. The haunting question remains, what would Lincoln have achieved? Could his unique blend of moral authority and political pragmatism have secured meaningful civil rights for 4 million freed Black Americans? It seems likely that his leadership would have been a decisive, stabilizing force that the nation desperately needed. For the freed people themselves, however, Lincoln's name became sacred. They saw him as Moses, the deliverer who had led them out of bondage. His picture hung in homes and churches. Stories of Father Abraham were passed down through generations. The enduring symbol. As the years passed, Lincoln's reputation soared. The nation began constructing a powerful Lincoln mythology, transforming the complex, melancholy man into an idealized figure of wisdom and moral clarity. This transformation was embodied by the Lincoln Memorial, dedicated in Washington, D.C., in 1922. Designed like a Greek temple, it enshrined Lincoln as an almost godlike figure, his massive seated statue looking out over the National Mall toward the Capitol he had saved. His words became a moral compass for the nation. Whenever the country struggled with its core values, it turned back to the 2 speeches inscribed on the memorial's walls, the Gettysburg Address, defining the nation as dedicated to equality, and the Second Inaugural Address, calling for reconciliation. In the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, Lincoln's legacy was deliberately invoked. When Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963, he chose the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, beginning his oration by calling on "a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today," who signed the Emancipation Proclamation. By claiming Lincoln's legacy, civil rights leaders pressured America to fulfill the promise of equality he had begun. 6 Pillars of Greatness. Historians consistently rank Lincoln first or second among American presidents. His greatness endures because his leadership offers timeless lessons. Several qualities stand out. 1. Capacity for growth. Lincoln never stopped learning. Born into poverty and ignorance, he taught himself law, literature, and even military strategy as president. He was never satisfied that he knew enough. 2. Moral courage and conviction. He took unpopular stands, opposing the Mexican-American War and issuing the Emancipation Proclamation against the advice of his political allies. He held firm on his core principles: slavery was wrong and the Union must be preserved. 3. Intellectual and moral evolution. Lincoln was not trapped by the prejudices of his time. His views on race and emancipation evolved tremendously, showing a willingness to change when experience proved him wrong. 4. Deep empathy and humanity. He felt the suffering of others. This empathy defined his leadership, from visiting hospitals to pardoning soldiers sentenced for desertion. He understood the human cost behind every decision. 5. Brilliant communication. Lincoln possessed an unmatched gift for rhetoric. His speeches, brief but profound, expressed complex ideas in simple, beautiful language that resonated across class and time. 6. Exceptional political skill and timing. He knew when to push, emancipation, and when to wait, Antietam. He assembled a cabinet of rivals, and managed them by maintaining his focus on the common good, not personal glory. The man behind the monument was complex and deeply human. He suffered from depression, faced self-doubt, and made mistakes. But he was also determined, compassionate, and capable of tremendous growth. The log cabin boy became immortal not because he was perfect, but because he showed us what is possible. His life is the ultimate testimony to the American promise, that ordinary people, guided by principle and commitment, can rise to extraordinary heights and change the course of history. He belongs to the ages, and his legacy continues to challenge every generation to build a more perfect union. Conclusion. We have journeyed together through the extraordinary life of Abraham Lincoln, from a one-room log cabin in Kentucky to the highest office in the land, from a boy with less than a year of formal education to one of history's most eloquent leaders, from a young man splitting rails on the frontier to the president who saved the Union and freed 4 million people from bondage. Lincoln's story is more than just a biography of a great president. It is a testament to the power of character and conviction, to what can be achieved through self-education, determination, and unwavering moral courage. He showed us that our origins do not define our destiny, that anyone willing to work, to learn, and to grow can rise to meet even the greatest challenges. From the poverty of his childhood, Lincoln developed empathy for those who struggled. From his self-education, he gained the wisdom and eloquence that would inspire a nation. From his personal losses, his mother, his sons, the terrible toll of war, he developed a depth of compassion that made him a leader who could feel the suffering of others. From his political battles and defeats, he learned patience, timing, and the art of building coalitions. And from the crucible of the Civil War, he emerged as a moral leader who redefined American democracy and gave the nation a new birth of freedom. Lincoln's gift to America and the world is profound and enduring. He preserved the Union when it seemed destined to fracture. He ended slavery, striking a blow for human freedom that resonated around the globe. He redefined American democracy, connecting it forever to the principle that all men are created equal. His words, from the Gettysburg Address to the Second Inaugural, continue to inspire people who struggle for justice and freedom. His example of leadership, combining strength with mercy, principle with pragmatism, moral vision with political skill, remains a model for leaders in every generation. But perhaps Lincoln's greatest gift is simply his life story itself, the proof that ordinary people can become extraordinary, that humble beginnings need not limit great achievements, that character and conviction can overcome any obstacle. In a world where we often feel powerless against forces larger than ourselves, Lincoln's life reminds us that individuals matter, that leadership matters, that courage and vision can change the course of history. As we reflect on Lincoln's courage and vision, we see a man who was willing to stand alone when necessary, to take unpopular positions when he believed they were right, to grow and evolve as circumstances changed. We see a leader who combined firmness on principles with flexibility on tactics, who could be both patient and decisive, who understood when to compromise and when to stand firm. We see a human being who struggled with depression and self-doubt yet found the strength to lead a nation through its darkest hour. We see someone who faced the most terrible decisions a leader can face, decisions about war and peace, life and death, and made those decisions with wisdom, humanity, and an awareness of their profound moral weight. Lincoln's own words provide perhaps the best closing reflection on his life and legacy. In his message to Congress in December 1862, as he was preparing to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln wrote, "We shall nobly save, or meanly lose, the last best hope of earth." He understood that America represented something precious and rare, a democracy dedicated to liberty and equality, a nation where government derives its power from the consent of the governed, where every person has the right to rise as far as their talents and efforts can take them. Lincoln saved that last best hope. Through his leadership, his vision, and his sacrifice, he ensured that government of the people, by the people, and for the people would not perish from the earth. He proved that democracy could survive even the most severe test. And he expanded the meaning of American freedom to include all people, not just some. As we conclude this journey through Lincoln's life, we are reminded of his own words from the Gettysburg Address, where he called on his generation to ensure that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. That call echoes across the generations. It speaks to us today, challenging us to continue the work Lincoln began, to strive toward the ideals he articulated, to build the more perfect union he envisioned. Abraham Lincoln's life proves that one person, armed with character, conviction, and courage, can change the world. From the log cabin to legend, from obscurity to immortality, his journey inspires us to reach higher, to work harder, to stand firmer for what we believe is right. His legacy calls us to be better than we are, to build a nation and a world more just, more free, and more united. The boy who read by firelight became a light unto the world. His words still illuminate our path. His example still guides our steps. His vision still challenges us to create that new birth of freedom he dreamed of. Abraham Lincoln belongs to the ages, and his story, his courage, and his conviction belong to all of us. Thank you for listening to Abraham Lincoln, A Life of Courage and Conviction, here on EchoLib. I hope this journey through Lincoln's remarkable life has inspired you as much as it has inspired me in researching and writing it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment below and let me know, what aspect of Lincoln's life resonated most with you? What surprised you? What lessons from his leadership do you think are most relevant today? And most importantly, what would you like to hear next on EchoLib? Your feedback helps me create the content you want to listen to. If you enjoyed this audiobook, please give it a like and subscribe to EchoLib for more compelling biographies and stories from history. Your support helps me continue creating these in-depth explorations of the lives that shaped our world. And if you're interested in learning about another transformative American leader, I invite you to continue your journey with my biography of Barack Obama, the story of another man who rose from humble circumstances to become president, whose life in many ways echoed Lincoln's themes of hope, change, and the power of the American dream. You can find that video on your screen right now. Click to continue exploring the lives of leaders who changed America and the world.